So the first time I ever really heard about cold plunging was Wim Hof's first appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience. And I don't really remember it too much. Overall, I remember it being a pretty good episode, but at the end of the day, I didn't think much of it. Nor did I even begin to consider cold plunging for at least a couple years after seeing that episode. However, once I did finally get into cold plunging, Wim Hof was all I ever heard about. And to me, the name Wim Hof is basically synonymous with cold plunging itself. And mostly everything you hear about Wim Hof is pretty positive. But every once in a while, I'll see something negative, and it'll of course catch my eye. So today I am going to react and give my opinion on this Wim Hof hit piece. Wim Hof Exposed: The Rise and Fall of the Wim Hof Empire by Scott Carney. And this hit piece has gone pretty viral. It's a video that's over an hour long, so I'm just going to go through the video and give my opinion. So off the bat, I will say I'm not a Wim Hof guy. I don't necessarily love him or hate him. To me, he just exists. And he's solid. He's a solid dude. The guy that made this, his name is Scott Carney. At first, I didn't really know who Scott Carney was, but he wrote this book, What Doesn't Kill Us, which I admittedly have not read, but I have seen this cover floating around the internet. Like, it's a pretty cool picture, pretty cool book cover. I'm definitely a judge the book by the cover kind of guy. So nonetheless, I do recognize Scott Carney from this book. And off the bat, I'll say this hour-long hit piece was okay. It was a decent watch. Definitely a little overdramatic and some totally uncalled for sections, but overall, it was decent. And like everything in this world, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. So there's Wim Hof's side, there's Scott Carney's side, and there's the truth. And hopefully that is what I will uncover in this episode. So the beginning of the hit piece starts with Scott Carney talking about his history with Wim. The two of them were friends. Scott wrote books about Wim, and he even helped promote him on TV. Scott's done tons of keynote speeches apparently. He's been on TV and always talking about Wim in a very, very positive light. And let's just say if Wim Hof is in fact a cult leader, and we kind of learned throughout this hit piece that Wim is kind of a cult leader or a guru of sorts, well, if that's the case, then Scott Carney definitely would have been a member of the cult of Wim. And the whole piece almost has like this vibe of a disgruntled son lashing out at his dad, or in this case, a disgruntled cult member lashing out at his cult leader. Kind of like those Scientologists who break away from the church and then start talking crap about it. Kind of like Leah Remini, for example, with the Church of Scientology. This just sort of has that feel.
I thought Wim's mix of inspiration and limit pushing was the perfect recipe for a cult leader. But after a week with the inveterate Iceman, I came away with an entirely unexpected opinion. Much to my surprise, his method worked.
So we can see here that he actually first met Wim because he wanted to actually debunk him as a cult leader. But as he says, Wim's methods actually worked. Basically, Scott is saying that he joined the cult. So anyway, Scott Carney and Wim Hof spent a lot of time together. At one point, Scott mentions that he actually hiked up Mount Kilimanjaro without a shirt with Wim. So doing all these crazy Wim Hof antics, kind of what made Wim Hof so famous and so viral. And like I said earlier, the two literally did media tours together. Scott wrote books on this stuff. Like, they were all in, just the two of them. And it's pretty clear that Scott greatly profited off of being a part of Wim Hof's life. And according to Scott, people started to die from Wim Hof's practices. So that's why Scott had to essentially turn on Wim, dismantle the friendship, and create this hit piece. So the next part of the hit piece goes on to talk about the fact that Wim Hof didn't actually create the Wim Hof method.
This was fueled not only by the media's glorification of him, but also by the fact that Wim stopped talking about his trips to India in the 1980s, where he learned impressively long Sanskrit mantras and even wrote...
Look at that. Wim Hof. Good looking dude. I will say he kind of looks like Kurt Cobain. Wim Hof, young Kurt Cobain. Heard it here first.
A book on yogic techniques. Very few people have mentioned that Wim's signature breathwork almost exactly resembles yogic breathing patterns called Neshasheka Rishaka Pranayama and Bhastrika Kumbhaka Pranayama. Also absent from the conversation was the use of hydrotherapy in the late 1800s and Porfiry Ivanov's, whose icy religious movement was wildly popular in Russia and Europe until his death in 1983. For almost 8 years, the media neglected all of that history and placed Hof on an almost impossible pedestal as the creator of cold exposure.
So yeah, Wim didn't create cold exposure. And quite frankly, I'm not even a little bit surprised, nor do I really care. Wim Hof exposed, pun intended, he exposed me personally to cold exposure through, of course, Joe Rogan. And quite frankly, that's all I care about. In my mind, Wim Hof did create this whole thing. And quite frankly, he packaged it and he brought it all together. So to me, that's all that really counts. And if you really want to be petty like Scott Carney is being here, nobody really created anything, because if you go by this logic, everybody is influenced by something that someone else did before them. Someone needs to tell Scott that this is how human civilizations work. We take inspiration from others and then we go on to make them better and improve them and make them ours. So yeah, this was just a very unnecessary part of this hit piece. Moving on, Scott goes on to basically imply that Wim is, in fact, an alcoholic.
When I first met Wim, I noticed that he had a large, bulbous nose that resembled the noses of alcoholics I'd grown up around.
So this is so savage. This is pure savagery. Calling Wim an alcoholic, calling out that nose, I mean, just firing ricochet shots at poor Wim here. Totally uncalled for. Now listen, I'm gonna say something crazy here. So, I can personally take one look at Wim Hof and tell you that the dude is not healthy. I mean, his hair is falling out, his skin looks terrible, he's not exactly thin, if you know what I mean. So, if anybody out there thinks that Wim Hof is healthy, I got news for you. He ain't. Well, he might be healthy in some aspects of his life, but he's certainly not healthy in every aspect of his life. But none of this takes away the fact that he's had some really impressive accomplishments. And he still is essentially the father of cold water exposure. And Wim has gone on to help improve the lives of so many people. So anyway, Scott goes on to further slander Wim by saying how bad of a parent Wim Hof is.
After his first wife, Olaya Hof, committed suicide, Wim abandoned his 4 children at a squat house in Amsterdam and took up with a woman who, I'll just identify her by her first name, which is Caroline, in another city. He left them in poverty, alone, without any support at all.
So yeah, Wim Hof, not a great dude. I personally don't see what his personal life has to do with his business necessarily, but Scott just loves dragging him. Ironically, Scott keeps saying throughout this entire video, throughout this entire hit piece, how much he respects and likes Wim, and then he just drags him. So, absolutely savage by Scott Carney here. And then we come to the best part. We come to my favorite part of this hit piece.
He has adopted a decidedly conspiracy theory forward stance on vaccines, Fauci, and how a shadowy New World Order controls the world's medical system and governments.
Oh my God. So you're telling me that Wim Hof doesn't believe in following Big Pharma, and maybe, just maybe, Wim Hof wants to do his own research. Maybe he questions the science, and maybe he doesn't want to take whatever Pfizer wants to go put in his arm. So when I watched this for the first time, this was at the exact moment when I personally turned. And I thought, yeah, Wim's actually kind of the man. See, when I hear this stuff, I'm like, damn, that guy's cool. That's cool to me. Conspiracy minded. Oh my God, what a monster. Scott just comes off so bad here. Like, he's really defending Fauci right now. And this was only done like 8 months ago. So 8 months ago, Scott is still defending Fauci. God forbid we don't trust our overlord Fauci. So anyway, to me, it just seems like Wim is like this rock star biohacker with definitely some vices. And Scott, on the other hand, he's just like this investigative journalist. He investigates. And it's become more and more clear that this guy will do anything to just get his story. So Scott continues to go on to tell the story of how Wim Hof got the scar on his stomach. And I'm going to be the bigger man, and I'm not going to repeat this story that Scott tells because it is so gross. I'm just not going to repeat it. I'm not going to repeat the fact that, according to Scott Carney, one day Wim Hof was waiting to meet his son, who he hadn't seen in 10 years. And while waiting, he decided to jump in a cold river. I'm not going to repeat the fact that that river had a fountain. And Wim Hof essentially squatted over the fountain, and the water literally shot up through his intestines and ripped a hole through his stomach, which caused Wim to actually have to go to the hospital. And that's apparently how he got his scar. I'm not going to tell you that story that Scott Carney puts in his hit piece, because it just seems like such a low blow and just so unnecessary. So yeah, needless to say, this whole first part of the story is just absolutely slandering Wim's character. And it's funny because the whole tone of this video is Scott just being all righteous and saying that he's doing this in order to save people. And all the while, he's just saying like the most meanest possible rumors about Wim, including certain parts he's exposing confidential text message between him and Wim. So once again, it's just sort of like slimy, you know? This whole thing just feels slimy. It feels icky. So we finally get to the good part. The part of this whole thing that actually matters. And now this is where I'll say that I'm actually back on Team Scott Carney, because this is the part that is actually important. So essentially, there's two main parts to the Wim Hof method. There's the breathing, and then there's the cold water immersion. And the catch is, and why Scott's video is so important, is that both the Wim Hof breathing and the cold water immersion should not actually be practiced together. So if there's one thing I need you to take away from this video is this: do not practice Wim Hof breathing with cold water immersion. If you're gonna do them separately. So now you may be asking, why is this? Well, Wim Hof breathing uses hyperventilation. And the disclaimer here is that I've actually never done Wim Hof breathing, so I'm just going off of his video. But essentially, Wim Hof breathing is something like this. I don't know, that's my take on it. I'm not really 100% certain, but basically the Wim Hof breathing is hyperventilating, and when you do this, you're signaling certain mechanisms to your brain, and then if you were to go on and do a breath hold right after that, you could pass out, which is explained here.
So hyperventilating is more likely to make you pass out in the water because you just shorten the reflex to breathe longer, which creates an illusion that you can hold your breath longer. You blow off all the oxygen in the red blood cells and it depletes it, and your brain and nervous system protect you by shutting you down very quickly.
So in some circumstances, when practicing hyperventilation breathing, your brain will protect you by shutting itself down. And so if you're doing these breathing exercises on land, you may pass out, but ultimately you'll wake back up, as this is what the body is meant to do in order to protect you. However, if you do this in water, or around water, if you pass out and you're in the water, you can very easily die. And this phenomenon is called shallow water blackout. And unfortunately, a good amount of people have died as a result of this. I guess the catch is kind of that if you practice hyperventilation before a breath hold, you can actually potentially hold your breath longer, as seen here.
I was actually pronounced dead in shallow water after taking an underwater swim challenge in a pool. Vacationing with my family, it was my competitive self that hyperventilated so I could hold my breath more easily.
But Chandler never emerged from underwater. When they finally realized something was very wrong, he was already gone. If not for the 2 doctors who happened to be by the pool, he would be.
Those doctors never stopped CPR, and after 5 minutes, they got a heartbeat and a pulse.
So this guy basically says that he was trying to hold his breath longer. He did some breathing techniques before the breath hold, not necessarily Wim Hof breathing, but similar, and bam, passed out underwater, had to be saved. Thank God this particular guy didn't die, but many people do. Because of course, these types of breathing exercises can result in your brain shutting itself altogether. So really, breath holding should only be practiced under supervision and never near a body of water, and especially not a cold body of water. So anyway, Scott goes on to show a bunch of cases of people dying or almost dying as a result of practicing Wim Hof breathing. He even mentions this one person who was doing Wim Hof breathing in a shower, passed out, and bumped his head. Got some bruises, not good. So anyway, the part where Wim Hof is actually exposed, and I believe Scott is actually in the right to do this hit piece, is that Wim Hof and his team are fully aware of this shallow water blackout phenomena, and they continue to support it. Well, sort of. And that's the claim that Scott is making. However, in my brief looking into all this, it does seem like Wim Hof and his team do put disclaimers on all their videos that their breathing should be practiced under supervision and never with water. I mean, granted, it's just a small little disclaimer, but it is there. And I do agree with Scott here that Wim Hof and his team really don't do enough to warn people about how dangerous their breathing techniques can be. And that's obviously because their whole business is based off of these techniques. And according to Scott Carney, 13 people have actually died doing the Wim Hof method, which has led to lawsuits and cover-ups from Wim Hof and his team. Now, I will say, I watched this whole thing and I had expected with like the crazy thumbnail and everything that there was going to be some big reveal, and this was the reveal. 13 deaths. 13 deaths. Now, not to take anything away from those people, but it seems like for all the hundreds and thousands of people who have bought the Wim Hof program and have been practicing his breathing, for 13 to die, to me, doesn't sound like that many. Especially considering you can't even say for certainty that this is how they died. I mean, yeah, there's lawsuits and everything, but you'll never actually know why they died. And as I've said millions of times, doing anything with water, especially cold water, is very, very dangerous. There's risks with everything. There's risks with driving your car, walking out into the street. There's risks with everything we do. But do we sue the car manufacturers every time there's an accident? No. And sometimes we do. So like I said, this whole thing, pretty nuanced. And this is kind of what Scott is saying here. He wants Wim Hof to be more liable, more accountable for the methods that they teach. And to Wim Hof's credit, they do claim over and over on their website that the breathing exercises should be done with supervision and not combined with cold water immersion. To which Scott plays this same clip over and over, which shows Wim Hof essentially doing a baptism.
And one of the members there later posted a video of the whole ceremony on the internet. It shows Wim leading the whole group in a series of 12 deep breaths and then a full inhale before submerging their heads together in the water. Now, while I doubt that anyone in that particular video would be in danger of drowning in this instance, the problem is that Wim is spreading a message that it is okay to connect these two practices at all.
For those just listening, this is a video of like 30 people with their arms around each other in an icy lake, and it shows them doing the hyperventilation breathing techniques, followed by all of them going underwater for a breath hold at the same time. And it's a baptism. So once again, this whole thing definitely has some serious cult vibes, and interestingly enough, Scott Carney plays this clip like 5 times throughout his hit piece. Essentially, this clip is Scott's whole thesis, because according to Scott, this clip is proof that Wim Hof encourages practicing his breath work with cold water immersion, which is what Wim Hof claims he does not do. But in reality, this clip to me seems like it's a one-off. This clip isn't part of Wim Hof's app. This was just like a clip shot by someone's cell phone who was recording, who happened to be there. So to me, I see this clip and I'm like, yeah, it's a bunch of wacky cult members doing an ice water baptism. This pretty much sounds like what cults do. Like, I'm not surprised at all. I don't know if I just don't think it's that big of a deal or just very par for the course, as you know, Wim's a guru, and there's some cult stuff with Wim. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. And I will say, to Scott's credit, Wim does put out a good amount of clips on his social media where he is practicing his breathing near cold water and everything. And yeah, I mean, people see this stuff and they want to be like Wim Hof. So they do it and they don't understand the risks, and it could be fatal. But like I say about cold water and everything like that, I mean, this stuff is dangerous. Like, jumping into cold water will always be dangerous. And then obviously combining hyperventilation breathing, that's going to make it even more dangerous. But I don't know. I mean, it's dangerous. People do this stuff at their own risk. I guess, like I keep saying, Scott's essentially just very upset that Wim doesn't warn people enough. I don't know. Scott's a little petty, and I feel like a lot of his hit piece is pretty much just reaching, grasping at straws. My ultimate take on this whole thing is that Wim Hof is a human. He's clearly a very flawed human, as we all are. I'm very thankful for Scott Carney for doing this work. I certainly loved diving into it, watching his video a few times, and then making this particular episode. As I said in the beginning, the truth lies somewhere in the middle, where Wim Hof definitely isn't some evil monster that wants people to die. And to me, he seems like just a pretty cool dude who's overall untrusting of the government and Big Pharma, as I am. He's doing life his own way and is apparently making a lot of money as he goes. Some of his methods are certainly a little suspect, and yeah, you probably shouldn't really do them. But if you do want to, there's definitely some benefits associated with them, as well as risks. So do your own research. I know that doing your own research is taboo as far as Scott Carney is concerned, but I'm a do my own research type of guy. And if there's anything to take away from this video, once again, if there's anything to take away from this video, do not do Wim Hof breathing near water. Also, the comments of this video are absolutely hilarious, and it seems like Scott got pretty ratioed on his own video, which I find funny. Wim and I have been friends for 10 years. Proceeds to drag his name through the dirt for 1 hour and 6 minutes. One of the guys that was interviewed by Scott comments that he was actually misquoted in the video. And it's just so many comments of people saying how great everything Wim has done for them have been, and how much his programs have helped them. And my favorite comment is this particular one. Many companies have disclaimers like, don't use our hairdryer or toaster whilst sitting in a swimming pool. If people ignore Wim's advice not to use his method in a swimming pool or alone, that's their problem. And this comment is really the crux of this whole thing, and what Scott just fails to understand. Everything in life comes with risk, and I'm glad Scott made this video so that we could further understand the risks, but it does seem like Wim and his organizations do provide the disclaimers, and people are going to do what people are going to do. Despite all the dragging from investigative journalist Scott Carney, to me, it seems like Wim Hof comes out on top here. This is the Cold Plunge podcast with me, Mike Gorman. Be sure to check out the video version of this podcast on our YouTube channel and check the show notes for any references, studies, or links to anything I spoke about on our website at plungereviews.com/podcasts. If you have a question you want answered or comment about the show, feel free to reach out in our official Facebook group, which is called Cold Plunge Community.